All right. Hello, Savma. Welcome back. Tony Bartels. I am here for the second of the three parts of Climbing Mount Debt, Navigating Your Student Loans and Repayment Options. This will be the Borrow Better portion. So in the previous session, just a quick highlight. And just to, make sure we all know where we are. This is the framework for the presentation. And in the last one, we talked about knowing your student debt, obtaining that federal student aid data file, uploading it into the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool, and estimating the D in the debt to income ratio equation using the in-school loan estimator. So using that cost of attendance information and what you're borrowing and anticipate borrowing for the remainder of your education will help you establish that D in the debt to income ratio equation. We also shared some numbers that recent graduate veterinarians are earning depending on where they find themselves within veterinary medicine. We'll continue to show those and make sure that you're aware of those numbers. That will become more clear as you're working your way through school and you start entertaining offers for employments or looking at your internship residency pathway, whatever you think you're going to do within veterinary medicine. And this session, we're going to talk about using that debt to income ratio to inform your borrowing strategy, but also how you might approach minimizing the borrowing that you're doing while you're in school. So let's head over to the Borrow Better section here and start looking at those steps that we can take to borrow less and reduce your future stress. So estimating your debt to income ratio at graduation, like we talked about in the first session, can really help to inform or better inform your borrowing strategy, right? So if you've got a lot of options, or maybe your family wants to provide some support, or you've got some private loans that either you could take or private loans from previous education that maybe you'd like to eliminate before you get out of veterinary school, all of these things can help us, or give us some ideas of what we can do to improve our student loan situation while we're in school and before we graduate and officially enter repayment. There is a lot you can do now. You may be limited in terms of how big of an impact you can make. A lot of these decisions have already been made when, pretty much when you decided which school you're going to go to, right? So like the example that we used in the last or in the first session, um, that person's a non-resident attending Kansas State, right? So there's no way for them to pay the in-state rate, so they're going to graduate with a student loan amount that is, within the range of what a non-resident would graduate with to pay for that education, right? So you have to set your expectations appropriately, and then do your best, the best that you can do to reduce the amounts that you can, so you have less to manage when you graduate. Right? It's always easier to manage less than it is to manage more. So that, again, that student debt to income ratio, that is one of the key metrics that we use when it comes to almost everything student loans, right? So how you borrow better or how you approach repayment is all based on your student debt to income ratio, not just the student debt number, right? We have to know what the income number is as well, because those two together will help to indicate your ability to service that debt, or essentially to, how hard it's going to be to pay it back after you graduate. And that's why we focus so much on helping you determine that student debt number and then matching it up against various income inputs depending on what you think you might do after graduation. But after running thousands and thousands of these simulations for our colleagues, there's some themes that emerge, right? So we can take that debt to income ratio and start to apply it, right? So if we know or are fairly confident that we're going to finish veterinary school with a student debt to income ratio that is less than 1, right? So that means that we anticipate our income to be greater than our debt, right? Then we don't have to worry about any of this forgiveness under the income driven repayment plans. We can be, as cost conscious as we want about the loans that we have. And, basically when you go to pay back your student loans with a debt to income ratio less than 1, it's going to be relatively easy for you to do that, right? You're going to be able to satisfy the minimum monthly payments no matter what repayment plan you choose, with the income that you're generating, right? Because it's only going to be a small share, that payment towards your student loans. There's only going to be a small share of the income that you're earning, and you'll also pay back that balance in a reasonable amount of time, likely 10 years or less. When your debt to income ratio is 2 or more, right? So you anticipate your debt balance to be 2 times your income after graduation, or maybe after your advanced training, or whatever your pathway is, where you're kind of done, you know, living like a student, and finally earning a market rate for the pathway that you've chosen. When your debt to income ratio is 2 or higher, it is quite likely that income driven repayment is going to be your most financially flexible and beneficial option. And in that case, we counsel people to pay the minimum that is required by their income and plan for the forgiveness. But when it comes to borrowing, if you anticipate your debt to income ratio to be 2 or higher, then you want to make sure that you keep as much of your total student loan balance in the federal system, so they're eligible for income driven repayment, so you can manage them using that single payment based on your income. Right? So this is why this is so important. And if you remember back from the first session, the average debt to income ratio for graduating veterinarians, those that have student debt, from the 2020 graduating class, was 2, right? So this is the norm, right? People finishing veterinary school with a debt to income ratio of 2 or more is actually the majority case. There is this gray zone, right? So if you find yourself between 1 and 2, it really kind of depends on the specifics of your circumstance. But I would encourage you to lean towards income-driven repayment. Once you get to that less than 1, then the game changes. But you want to make sure that you're there, and you have a pretty good idea of what your situation looks like at that point. Income-driven repayment can really help you get there. Again, because you make sure that you're not paying more than you have to towards your student loans, and it gives you some more room in your budget to do those other things, other than pay back your student loans. But again, in order to be eligible for income driven repayment, when it comes to borrowing, we have to make sure that we're using federal student loans, right? So if you anticipate being greater than 1, essentially, you want to make sure that the majority or all of your student loan balance falls into that federal student loan category, so you can make them eligible for these income-driven repayment plans. So once again, just to kind of remind you of that data, so the debt from those who reported debt in the 2020 graduating class from the U.S. colleges of veterinary medicine, right? So this doesn't even include, some of the foreign accredited schools and the Caribbean schools, right? So this is just the U.S. colleges of veterinary medicine, and it was about 205,000, and the highest income number here was about 97,000. Right. So again, we're at 2 to 1, kind of in that average scenario for debt to income ratio. You could do this, just as a refresher, right? So the My Student Loans tool, you can use that information. Let me just bring you back over to what we had done previously in the My Student Loans realm. And if you're logged in, right? So if you went through that session the last time and you logged in your file, and you uploaded your file, but you're logged into VIN here like I am, right? You can pull up that most recent file that you've uploaded, right? So you don't have to keep doing that. So it'll save those files in there for you, right? But this is what that looks like. So we obtained our student aid data file, uploaded it to the My Student Loans tool, and now we can review that information here, project that as well at graduation, so we have an idea of what that debt to income ratio number will be using the in-school loan estimator. We'll come back to that because I'm going to show you some of the tips and tricks that you can use to hopefully reduce some of those amounts between now and when you graduate. So kind of building on how we can use this debt to income ratio as a guideline to inform our borrowing. So if we know that we're going to finish with a debt to income ratio less than 1, right? Again, so our income is going to be equal to or greater than our student debt balance, then we want to look for the lowest interest rate loan we can find. Doesn't really matter if it's private or federal. Federals are fine, because those are some of the easiest ones to get, and they also come with some really nice benefits. Family loans are okay, right? So if your family wants to help and you're going to pay them back, this is when that works, right? When your debt to income ratio is going to be less than 1. If it's going to be greater than 2, right? So your student debt balance is going to exceed your income by 2 times or more. You want to really, really make sure you're doing as much as you can to keep as much of your federal student loans as possible in that federal system. Right? I would avoid private loans, avoid family loans. That's a lot of money to owe to your family, and they may not understand why it's hard for you to make those payments. When your income may not be sufficient to handle that. It also takes off the table, income-driven repayment or even public service loan forgiveness that we'll talk about in the next session. Those are benefits that are only eligible for federal student loans. If you're between 1 and 2, again, just to be on the safe side, I would try to keep as much of your balance as possible in the federal student loan system, so you have access to those income-driven repayment plans or public service loan forgiveness, depending on where your career takes you. These mixed loan portfolios, so when I say mixed loan portfolio, I'm talking about having a combination of federal student loans and private student loans. When you can certainly put the federal student loans in the income-driven repayment plan, but they don't care if you have private loans, right? And your private loans don't care if you have federal student loans. They're going to have their own separate minimum monthly payment, which means now you're going to have 2 monthly payments that you're going to have to make to the private lender and to the federal student loan Department of Education, right? So that will increase the monthly burden of your student loan payment by having 2 different loan types that you have to service after graduation. So federal student loans, we talked about this briefly in the first session, but these are the predominant loan types that fall in the federal student loan universe that I most commonly see from graduating veterinarians, right? So these direct loans, direct unsubsidized, direct grad plus loans are still a type of direct loan. Direct subsidized loans, these are ones that you're only going to have from undergrad. If you started your educational career before 2010, right, at any point, right, not just veterinary school, but anytime you did higher education, you might have a FEL loan if you started before 2010. Perkins loans, I think they were discontinued in 2018. So if you were in the higher education system and were eligible for those Perkins loans around that time frame, you may still have those. I do see health profession student loans quite commonly, particularly at the state schools, and then loans for disadvantaged students as well. All of these loan types, right? So this is when I say keep your loans in the federal system, this is what I mean. Using one of these loan types, if not all direct loans or whatever, these all can be consolidated into a federal direct consolidation loan that makes them eligible for income-driven repayment, public service loan forgiveness, and all of the other beneficial provisions that come with federal student loans. If you have federal student loans now from undergrad or before veterinary school and you're not sure what to do with them, leave them alone, right? They probably have a lower interest rate. Many of them are probably subsidized as well. So they're not really costing you anything. They're not costing you anything now anyway, because the interest rates are all shut off because of the pandemic forbearance. And then you can consolidate them, add them to your consolidation loan after school if it makes sense to do so. Right, so they can be eligible for the same repayment plan that you're using for all of your veterinary school loans after you get done with your education. Private loans, again, these are all loans that aren't federal loans, right? So most of the time they're going to have the organization name in them. So Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Discover. Sometimes you'll find them from specific nonprofit foundations, or depending on the school that you're attending, they may have a collection of private loans that have, some benefits associated with them. But they're not federal loans, right? They're not, and there's no way to take a private loan and put it in to the federal student loan system. So that's where you have to be really careful, right? So generally speaking, for veterinary school anyway, you shouldn't need private loans, right? You can get up to the cost of attendance, right? So that published tuition, fees, living expenses that the school provides to the Department of Education and makes publicly available. That's what sets the maximum that you can borrow. That should be sufficient to cover all of your veterinary education related expenses. Um, again, so if you're running short on your federal student loans while you're in veterinary school, then start asking some questions, because that's really, really, really hard to do. So you shouldn't need private loans to finance your veterinary school education as long as you're eligible for federal student loans. More commonly, I see private loans to cover, what you can't borrow in undergrad, right? So there are more limits on how much you can borrow for undergrad. So that typically pushes people into that private loan category a little bit sooner. There are very few. I've only seen a handful. I literally can count them on one hand of private loans across all of the veterinary student um, loan profiles that I've seen that I might consider using. And those are in very, very, very rare circumstances. Again, when that debt to income ratio is less than one, it's usually a good idea. But the problem is they just don't have the flexibility. Even if they, don't have any interest during school and they, start charging you interest after, the problem is you still have to make a second payment, right? So you have to have a payment towards your federal student loans plus a payment towards those private student loans. So again, unless your debt to income ratio is less than one and you can maybe finance that education entirely with those private loans, um, it really doesn't make sense to add them to your federal veterinary school loans as well. Review the terms carefully. Sometimes I find that they can be career limiting, right? So if you've got a pretty hefty balance of private loans and they don't have very good deferment provisions and you want to do an internship and residency, that can get complicated, right? When you're making 35 grand a year and you've got $50,000 of private loans that want a $500 monthly payment, that's going to be really, really difficult, right? So they can be career limiting depending on the amount and what the provisions are for repayment. If you can, now this is a little bit controversial here, but right now we've got access to some really beneficial federal student loans. The interest rates are quite low. They're actually off through September. If you can put a dent in some of those private loan balances with those federal student loans, you may improve your situation when you reach repayment. However, right, just know that you're replacing one loan with another, right? You still have an appreciable balance that you have to manage. It's not going away, right? But you can work to improve the flexibility of repayment using some of the federal student loans to pay down some of those less beneficial private student loans. When it comes to family or personal funds that either your spouse or your family or somebody else wants to help you with, make sure that you're both on the same page, right? Is it a loan or is it a gift? I do see this cause some confusions, right? I mean, I see a lot of the students are very well-meaning, right? They want to pay back their parents for the loan, and then the parents say, well, no, it was a gift, and there's some differences there of opinion, right? So make sure that you establish that pretty clearly up front. If it is a loan, then establish terms. I mean, you don't have to make it as formal as a bank, but at least write something down on paper that says, how much you're borrowing, what interest that it has associated with it, and what that family requires in terms of a minimum monthly payment and how long they expect you to take to pay back that balance, right? So just establish some of those basic terms or have that conversation so there's no surprises. If you're married or you've got a significant other that's helping you through veterinary school, um, make sure that they're focusing on their personal financial wellness first, right? So you shouldn't, I'm sure they want to help and they want to keep your costs down, and that's great. But they shouldn't be sacrificing things like emergency funds or retirement funds or, paying off credit card debt just so you can reduce the amount that you have to take in student loans, right? You do have, it's a balance, and you have access to some really, really beneficial and flexible loans while you're in veterinary school. What you don't want to do is sacrifice yours or your spouse's um, short-term or long-term financial wellness just to reduce the amount of student loans you have, right? So make sure that they've got a good financial wellness plan in place first, and they're not sacrificing any of those crucial elements before they start to help you reduce your student loan balance while you're in school. Scholarships and grants, they're out there. It depends on the school. Every school is a little bit different. The AABMC has some pretty good data on the scholarships and the average amounts and which schools are doing a really good job of providing them. But the average across all of the schools is about $5,000 per amount. and about half of all veterinary students receive them, right? So it's great if you can get it, right? $5,000 a year would be great. $20,000 less if you know that you would have to manage when you get to repayment. So look for those opportunities. Make sure that if you do receive a scholarship, that it's actually going towards the tuition, right? So you're not just, you receive the scholarship, but you also receive the same amount in loans. You're really not gaining any ground there, right? So just make sure that it gets reflected in your financial aid award. Sometimes I see that the timing of how those scholarships are applied are a little bit off when it comes to the financial aid award process. So just double check there that you're not also taking the loans that correspond to the amount of scholarship that you're receiving. Okay, so tips and tricks. So when you look at your financial aid award, and I really, you don't have to do this every day or even every month, but there are two specific times during the year where your financial aid award is extremely important. So you apply for your loans every year, and then you get a breakdown of, well, this is what you've been offered, how much do you want, right? And you have an opportunity at that point, pretty much at the beginning of each semester, to change those amounts that you're offered. So really take a look at that point and see, is this more than I need, right? Do I have a budget that allows me to demonstrate that maybe I don't need $20,000 in living expenses. I only need, 12 or 15, right? So if you can reduce the amount that they offered you and not take it, right, then that's less that you have to manage when you get to repayment, and it's less that you'll accrue interest on as well uh, during veterinary school. You can always go back, right? And if you need more, you can always go back and borrow up to that financial aid award cost of attendance. So it's not like if you decline, $3,000 for the semester that you just forfeit it completely. If you really need it, you can go back and say, I know I declined this $3,000, but I can really use, another $1,000. You can go back and request up to that that maximum cost of attendance. But this is where having a budget, right? That's how, how are you going to know if you can adjust your financial aid award? And the only way you can do that is by budgeting, right? And that really does kind of require a monthly look at your finances, so your income is mostly from your student loans, your expenses, that's going to be up to you to manage those. That's going to be different for everybody. How many roommates you have, how much your rent and utilities and all of those things that are kind of your major expenses on a monthly basis. How much does it cost you to live at your where you're receiving your veterinary education, and is there an opportunity for you to reduce the amount that you're being offered in loans? I would encourage you to, because the way that you receive your financial aid award right at the beginning of the semester, they basically pay all your tuition and everything that you owe to the school, and then you receive a big refund essentially into your account, and you have to figure out a way to use that chunk of money to cover all of your expenses for the semester. That's not that's not normal, right? Nobody's really paid like that. Right? So what I would suggest you do is open a separate savings account that earns you some interest. It's not going to be a lot of interest right now, but that's okay. And transfer the bulk of that refund into that separate savings account, and then set up monthly transfers back into your main account that kind of mimic a paycheck, right? So now you're paying yourself based on what you've budgeted for your expenses, and that can help you control your spending, right? I mean, if you put all the money into one pot, right, it's quite likely that you're going to spend your way through it, right? But if you put some controls and checks and balances on it, like separating and set up a second account and transfer it as you need it type of thing, that really helps you develop good habits, as well as control your spending and make it a little bit more apparent how much you need each month and whether or not you can borrow less going forward. If you can shift costs to less expensive loans, health professional student loans, they don't charge you any interest during school, and they have a 5% interest rate when you're in repayment. They also can be included in that consolidation, right? So throw your hat in the ring for those if you think you might be eligible. You have 120 days from the time that you receive your financial aid awards to return them. And if you return them in that 120-day window, you'll also return any of the fees and interest associated with it, right? So this is better than making payments towards your interest while you're in school. If you have some loans that you took that are more than you need and they're accruing interest, um, consider returning a chunk of those during that 120-day window, and that will actually go farther than just making payments on the interest. That 120 days is a long time, right? So, for instance, last semester, if you started like Kansas started first week of August, you have almost until Christmas break there to decide if you want to make a return of some of those excess financial aid awards. Same with the spring semester. I mean, it's almost the entire semester that you have to determine whether or not you have more than you need, and you can still make that return, which goes farther than making a payment towards the loans. Again, COVID-19 has kind of thrown this up in the air a little bit, right? You're not accruing interest, so it doesn't really make sense to return the funds in excess that, because you haven't accrued any interest on those funds that you've received so far, and you won't even for the ones that you receive next fall, right? Next fall, you're still going to have another couple of months where you have no interest accruing on your student loans. That's a really beneficial period, right? So you can consider, maybe using those funds to build an emergency fund, right? There's nothing wrong with using student loans to have an emergency fund. It's certainly a lot cheaper than having to turn to a credit card. So look at your budget, establish an emergency fund even while you're in school, and you can use your student loans to do so. And if you still have more than you need after all of that, right, then here's some of the things that you might consider, right? So we've talked about the emergency fund, 3 months of expenses maybe as a target, but again, that you're going to need that budget to determine whether or not or what 3 months of expenses would be for you. I do find that roughly speaking, about a quarter of students are making payments towards their student loans while they're in school. Again, I just don't find this to be very beneficial. Um, your money will go farther by reducing the principal than just making payments on the interest. And the only way that you can directly influence the principal while you're in school is to return or reduce the award amounts that you're offered. Um, again, because the way that federal student loans are structured, when you just write a check to the loan servicer, they first put that money towards interest. And then if once you've paid all the interest off, if that's possible for you to do, then you start to influence the principal, right? So if you really want to influence the principal, you return or reduce the award amounts that you received in that 120-day window. If you've got a credit card balance, this is a great time to pay it off, right? Pay off the credit cards, even using some of your student loans if you have to, but then cut up that credit card, right? Don't use that credit card until you're in a position to pay it off in full every month. Use only for super, super duper emergencies. And that's after you've exhausted your emergency fund, right? That's why you have the emergency fund, so you don't have to pull out that credit card. But sometimes, stuff happens and you want to have, you're going to need to cover an unexpected expense that might be beyond your emergency fund. But again, make sure you have an emergency fund so you can reduce that likelihood. This is where, get paying down some of those private student loans if you have them to reduce the impact that they'll have on your quality of life and ability to pursue, advanced education potentially after you graduate. If you've got a job, if you're earning income, then you may want to consider contributing some of that earned income to some kind of retirement account, like a Roth IRA. So, you have to have a job to be able to do that. But you can use the student loans to supplement some of your expenses and put that income that you earn while you're working towards a retirement account that will grow exponentially until you need it in retirement versus, the small impact it can make towards your student loans. So those are some things you can do if you've got more in your budget. If you've got less, right? If you find that you need more, make sure you're reviewing your financial aid award carefully. Did you accept the full award? Is there amounts that you can go back and request? Did you apply for the Grad Plus loans, right? So I do find sometimes people don't realize there's a second application, right? You're only allowed to receive that $40,500 in direct unsubsidized loans, but you can receive up to the cost of attendance in direct Grad Plus loans, but you have to submit a second application for those. So 40,500 is not the limit. It's only the limit on the direct unsubsidized loan. The limit is actually the cost of attendance that your school publishes. Do you have a budget, right? Again, it all comes down to the B word. If you don't have a budget, you really don't, again, you can't manage what you don't measure. So if you're not measuring your living expenses, it's going to be hard to know where your money is going every month and how you can actually influence those items. Most veterinary students are excellent at keeping their costs down. Roommates, finding those scholarships, squeezing in part-time jobs. I mean, those are all those, low-hanging fruit when it comes to keeping your expenses as low as possible. All right. So once again, want to remind you all of the live question and answer session we'll be doing. So if after you've reviewed these sessions, you have questions of your own or questions specific to your circumstances, then bring them to the live Q&A session during the SAVMA Symposium. That's going to be Sunday, March 14th at 1 p.m. Central Time. For those of you, again, that are interested in learning more about personal finance, I would encourage you to sign up for the free Personal Financial Success course. It's a collaboration between Drip.vet, VIN, and VIN Foundation, completely free for students, and it drips out that financial information, right, that a lot of us, just don't have any familiarity with, and it helps you build that foundation of financial knowledge over time, and it's very valuable information that you'll benefit from throughout your career. I do want to take you back to and show you how we can use some of these principles to influence our debt at graduation, right? So if, again, I'm going to take this and send this over to the in-school loan estimator. This was the example that we've been using and working from. I've got 3 years left to borrow. My average on my direct unsubsidized loans, I'm taking a guess on my subsidized loans here. And then, before we were borrowing about $70,000 per year, right? And, and I think we indicated that we were going to do this for interest rates, 5.5, we'll make this 5.75. Now, if you can get, scholarships, right, that will help to reduce some of those funds. This $70,000, I don't have the Kansas State living expenses handy, but this was about $5,000 less than the total cost of attendance. And there was probably about another $3,000 there that you could make up if you could live off of just the room and board and the books and supplies numbers, which comes out to about $12,000 per year, which a lot of students tell me seems like a reasonable amount for them to navigate their living expenses as a veterinary student. Now that's going to be different depending on which school that you're attending and the cost of living in that area. But this was our estimate if we were on the same path, right? But if we can knock off another $3,000 per year from our estimate, right? That's another 12,000 or more that will matriculate through here, right? So it reduces the interest as well. Just the little bit that I can put a dent in there. Before we were at 320 or closer to that. That will reduce the amounts that we have to manage. Right now, if let's say my family wants to help and they've got $10,000 that they want to put towards it, right? So this will actually factor that in. And I want to show you how the difference between applying this $10,000, say in year 2 versus applying it in year 4, right? So right now we've got $308,000. So that $10,000 up front had the equivalent of nearly a $12,000 impact in the first year, right? Or the second year in this case. Now, if I do this $10,000 in the 4th year, maybe they're like, "Hey, congratulations! We wanted to make sure you're going to make it," or whatever, right? So that impact goes down, right? So that has basically the $10,000 impact, the equivalent amount. But if I do that earlier in the program, I actually get another $2,000 out of that because it reduces the amount of interest that I accrue on this 2nd year loan for the duration of the veterinary school program, right? So having them apply that upfront, or the most that you can apply from outside sources in the earlier years of the program will have bigger impacts on putting a larger dent in your overall student loan balance. Okay, so we'll generate this. We'll leave this one open, and then we'll use this one to simulate some repayment strategies when we get to the next session. So that will conclude the borrow better portion of this. And I will meet you in a few here for the final session where we'll talk about repayment and repayment strategies using all of the information that we've covered so far. See you soon.